Hello, and thank you for joining us. This will just give a quick guide to private housing from the SU Advice Centre. So what will we cover in this session? We'll go over how to make good housing choices for the next academic year, the importance of taking your time, not rushing, not panicking, and making sure you find accommodation that's right for you, what to look out for, so some quick do's and don'ts, and how the Advice Centre can support you with all of this. So just before we start, meet the Advice Centre team. So we're a team of 3 full-time staff members. We have 2 welfare advisors, myself and Bianca, and an Advice Centre manager, Minaz. So if you do ever come to us for some support, it'll be one of our faces who helps you. So what makes house hunting successful? So we believe there are a range of factors that helps you to find the property that's right for you. So the firstly is the location. So make sure that the property that you choose is in the right location, whether you choose to live in Coventry or Leamington Spa. Consider how far of a commute it will be to campus and what sort of community you're wanting to be in. Making sure that it's people that you want to share with. So depending on the tenancy that you sign, it is highly likely that there would be some communal responsibilities and some areas in the property that you would have to share with your housemates. So it is important that you feel confident with who you choose to live with. And finally, making sure it's affordable. So consider your income versus your expenditure, how much your rent will be, what will be included in the rent, and any costs on top. So for example, if your utilities aren't included in your rent, how much they will averagely cost on top of that, and make sure that you can realistically afford that. So the biggest message we want you to take home from this presentation is not to panic. So there's often a myth with students that you have to find accommodation by Christmas time or there won't be any available for next academic year, and that is completely a myth. There is more accommodation than students in Warwick, and there's plenty of accommodation to choose from. So please don't make a rush decision. It's really important to remember that a tenancy agreement is a legal binding document. So once you are signed for that property, you are contract bound. So this means it's extra important to make sure you take your time to choose accommodation that's right for you and make sure that you feel confident in the choice. So planning is vital when you're trying to find the perfect property. So consider and answer the following questions. So who do you want to share your property with, and how many of you are in the group? What location do you want to live in? So do you want to be near campus? Do you want to be in town in Coventry or Leamington Spa? And is the commute realistic for you? The type of property you want to be in. So if you want to be in a shared house or a studio or a flat. And what is your budget? So make sure you look for the best value. So if you are looking for a property with quite a few students, just bear in mind that our research actually indicates that larger properties work out significantly more expensive per person than smaller properties. So for example, some larger properties are more expensive and they're not of a good standard, whereas you could consider splitting the group, getting a property for 5 or 4 students, and getting 2 different properties that are in close proximity to each other, and that might actually save you some money in the long run. So actually choosing accommodation, so it can be quite overwhelming when you do start to property search, because there are a variety of providers to choose from. There's a lot of different styles and accommodation out there, and it can seem quite overwhelming. No matter what accommodation you choose, all landlords are expected to meet legal standards. So make sure you're familiar with what these legal obligations are. And if you are a little worried that these legal obligations aren't being followed, make sure you get some advice on that. If you can, we'd always encourage you to arrange a viewing before you sign the contract, and if you can, an in-person viewing, just because then you can do a thorough walk around of the property, make sure that there aren't any issues, and if you do spot any issues, you can report those to the landlord or the letting agent to ask them to get them resolved. You can make sure that you're fully okay with the location, get a proper feel for the property, and make sure that you're completely comfortable in signing. Where possible, we'd always encourage you to seek a recommendation from former tenants or students. So the SU are soon going to launch the Rate Your Landlord platform, which is a website that allows students to publish reviews of their landlord or letting agent and their property, with the purpose of informing fellow students when they then go on their property search. Okay, so you found a property that you're interested in, the first steps. So make sure you read all the information about the property, make sure you're fully familiar with what sort of property it is, what's included in the cost, so if your utility bills are included in your rent, how many people you'll be sharing with, and the location that it's in. Make sure you do some research on the landlord or letting agent and make sure that you feel confident that they are reputable. Check affordability. So as I've said, make sure you know what costs are included and what costs you'd have to pay on top of that to make sure that you can afford that with your income. Look at the energy performance certificate and arrange a viewing. So as I've said, we'd always encourage you to do a physical viewing if possible, just because then you can get a thorough walk around of the property. Make sure you consider who will be managing the property, so whether that will be directly through a landlord or whether you'll need, or whether it will be letting agent managed, and make sure you consider whether you will need a guarantor. So understanding the costs. So make sure you understand the cost and what it is and why you're being asked to pay it before you pay anything. And the only legitimate fees that agents can charge are capped. So legally, they can only charge a month's rent in advance, a tenancy deposit that is capped at 5 weeks worth of rent. In some cases, they might ask you for a holding deposit, which is basically when you've seen the property, putting down a week's worth of rent so that you can hold that property while you're signing the agreement. It's just important to note that if the landlord backs out at any point, so if they decide not to go through with the application, you do actually get that holding deposit back. However, if you decide not to go through with that, so the tenant decides to terminate the agreement, then you don't actually get that holding deposit back. So that's just something to keep in mind. Make sure you're familiar with what needs to be paid when. So the costs that we've just gone over, they will likely need to be paid when you sign the agreement, so before the start of the tenancy. So make sure that you have the funds for that, make sure that you know when they need to be paid and when your rent will need to be paid, so whether that will be monthly or termly. So in terms of the tenancy agreement itself, so as we've already covered, a tenancy agreement is a legally binding document. It's therefore important that you fully read and fully understand that contract and fully feel confident in what that means. Consider the type of agreement that you are signing. So if you are in a property where there are multiple students, it's likely that you will be signing a joint and several contract where all of you are effectively treated as one and you're all equally liable for the clauses in that agreement, including rent, versus an individual agreement. So if you are in, say, a studio or maybe in room shares, if you sign the tenancy agreement as one person and there aren't any other tenants on that agreement, then you will be the sole tenant on there and you will be solely responsible for the rent. So consider what type of agreement you're signing and make sure you know what that means. It's important to note that most student contracts are assured short-hold tenancies, and this means that they are fixed term. So they're fixed for a certain amount of time, usually for around 11 months for the length of an academic year. And that often means that there is no break clause. So unfortunately, if you do want to leave that agreement early, it will typically be finding a replacement tenant to take over your place on the contract. So things to look out for when you actually go to the viewing. So ask to see gas and electrical safety certificates, and then you can know that these checks have been done and that it is safe. Make sure there's also a notice displayed with contact details of who you can contact in an emergency, and this should be in the communal areas of the property, such as the kitchen or the living room. Just in terms of little details of things to look out for as well. So final exit doors should have a thumb lock, so where you turn a knob to unlock or lock the door, and instead of a key lock. So that will be in the living room or maybe in the kitchen. Those doors should have a thumb lock. There should also be smoke detectors, at least in the hall and the landing, and a heat detector in the property. It's important to just note that bigger properties may need more fire alarms. And there should also be a fire blanket in the kitchen. Okay, so what happens after you've signed the tenancy agreement? So when you sign the tenancy agreement, there are a few documents that you should receive. So you should receive a copy of the government's How to Rent guide, and this is the government guidance of how to rent, what your rights are as a tenant and what your responsibilities are as a tenant. You should also receive a copy of the Energy Performance Certificate and the Gas Safety Certificate. You should finally receive a copy of your deposit protection certificate up to 30 days after paying the deposit. Now, this is a really important one to note because legally landlords have to ensure that your deposit is protected under a government approved scheme. So make sure that you do get confirmation that that has happened. And if you're unsure, make sure you ask which scheme your deposit has been protected in. Okay, so as we've said, check the property before moving day. So even though you've already signed the agreement, it's always a good idea to ask if you can arrange a viewing before you can move in. Just because if you do spot any issues that need rectifying before you move in, you can inform the landlord or letting agent then and give them a chance to have those resolved before moving day. So on moving day, there's a few things that you need to make sure that you do to make your tenancy as smooth sailing as it can be. So on moving day, an inventory will be taken, and this is basically a record of the condition of the property on that day. That's then used as a comparison for when you move out. So to compare the condition of the properties on both days, and then if there are any issues or any damages that are recorded, it can be shown that they are the tenant's fault, and that can later lead to deductions from your deposit. Because it can lead to deductions on your deposit, it's really important that you record the inventory accurately. So when you move in, do a thorough walk round of the property, take time-dated photos and videos, even of areas that you wouldn't think of, like marks on the walls and of the mattress, so that you can record that's the condition that the property was on that day, and you can show that those issues aren't due to the fault of the tenant. While you are doing a walk round, if you do see any damages, make sure you report those. It might also be a good idea to ask your letting agent or landlord on their process for reporting repairs. Some letting agents might have an online platform where you submit a request online, whereas some independent landlords might prefer for you to contact them directly. So make sure you ask them what the process is so that you're aware. And finally, check you've been given a gas safety certificate. And take meter readings. So if you're in a property where you are paying your utility bills independently, so your utility bills aren't included in your rent, it's a good idea to take meter readings, because when you go to set these up, you'll be asked by the utility providers to give these readings. So throughout the tenancy, so if you do experience any issues throughout the tenancy, it's important you let the letting agent or landlord know straight away. As a tenant, you do have a responsibility to make sure that you make them aware of any issues as soon as you become aware of them. If you do have any issues, make sure you keep these documented. So take photos and videos of the issues. It's also a good idea to communicate with the landlord in a written format. So for example, over email. If you do have a verbal conversation, that's completely fine, but just politely ask them to follow up with an email outlining what was discussed and the action plan set, just because then you have a written paper log of when you reported the issue and what was agreed. So when things go wrong, so if things unfortunately do go wrong during the tenancy, we'd always encourage you to attempt to informally resolve them if possible. So speak with your landlord or letting agent, try and negotiate a solution and try and resolve the issue. We do completely understand that this might not always be possible, or it might be that you've tried to do this and it hasn't been successful. In these cases, there may be more formal options that you can pursue. We'd always ask you to access professional support straight away, such as the Advice Centre. So the sooner you come to us when you're experiencing issues, the more options that are available to you and the more that we can help. So please do get in touch. So important things to consider throughout your property searching. So signing a tenancy agreement does equal paying the rent. So as I've said, it is a legally binding document. And once you have signed that, you are contract bound. This means that you are liable for those rent payments. It's more common than not that there isn't a break clause in the tenancy agreement, which means if you want to leave early, you will either have to negotiate with the landlord for you to have an early release, usually based on exceptional circumstances, or most likely you have to find a replacement tenant to take up your place in the contract. Finally, your deposit must be protected under a government-approved scheme. So this is a legal requirement, and if your deposit hasn't been protected, you can actually claim up to 3 times the amount of the deposit. So make sure you're familiar with what scheme your deposit is protected in, and make sure you get confirmation of that. So common mistakes that we often see students making. So the biggest mistake is not inspecting the condition of the property on move-in day or when they're viewing the property. So either when you go to view the property, not doing a thorough viewing, not actually attending a viewing and signing the agreement, or after you've signed on move-in day, not inspecting the condition of the property accurately. This then leads on to not completing the inventory or documenting any issues. So if your issues aren't documented in that inventory, it can't be proven that it wasn't the tenant's fault when you then go to move out. So you can actually have deductions made from your deposit. So making sure that you complete that inventory accurately and thoroughly is really important to avoid any future charges. And finally, not accessing professional support straight away. So as I said, the sooner you come to us, the more we can help and the more options that are available to you. So please do come to us as soon as you start experiencing any issues. So what is the Advice Centre and how can we help you with this? So we're part of the Students' Union, which means we're completely independent from the university, and we can offer impartial advice, support and representation on any issues affecting your student experience. We are a completely confidential service. All our advisors are professionally trained and we are free of charge. We are an information and empowerment based service. And this means that when you come to us, we will give you information on all the options that are available to you for you to then feel confident in choosing an option that you think is in your best interests. We are offering a digital service at the moment, so you can access us by our advice service inquiry form, which is on the SU website under help and support, as you can see in the screenshot. Thank you for listening and good luck house hunting.